will go ahead and put a copy of the agenda in the chat, which we can possibly provide a couple of times through the meeting so that as people join, they'll be able to see it. But if you'd like to see the agenda that we're going through, you can see it there. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to start with a quick introduction to where this work came from and what we are here to do together. And then I'll pass on to Dylan Giambattista and Gabrielle Stebbins, who are the co-chairs of this effort. And I know most of the people I see on this call, but I don't actually know everyone. So I don't know that everyone has a background of Energy Action Network, and wanted to give a very brief overview of what Energy Action Network is and where this work comes from. So EAN is a diverse collection of more than 200 members and public partners, which includes businesses, utilities, nonprofits, universities, and others who share our mission, which is achieving Vermont's climate and energy commitments in ways that create a more just, thriving, and sustainable future for Vermonters. And in addition to that network, to serve and support the network, we have a small nonprofit organization that's well known for collecting and sharing data about Vermont's progress towards our energy and climate commitments, and also serving as a neutral convener to bring together network members and partners to steward a common agenda. I do want to note that EAN does not lobby for particular bills, but we do facilitate these network action teams, such as this one about climate workforce. And this climate workforce network action team got started at our summit in the fall. There was a pitch process, and this work was chosen as the top priority of the network to move forward and do some work on. So that's what we're starting right now. We have a small steering committee that's met a couple of times to move forward on this, and this is our first large scale meeting to sort of share what we're thinking and hopefully invite a lot of you to be involved in this work going forward. So I would like to introduce Dylan Giambattista from VGS, who is one of the co-chairs of the work, and he will give us a little bit more of an introduction.
All right, Cara, thank you so much for that introduction, and hello, everyone. I hope some of you got a snack or something before we started this session, maybe got your coffee going. We want to make sure that you're very engaged and very happy. I see a few people nibbling, so that's always a good sign for a lunch meeting. But hello, everyone. I'm Dylan Giambattista. I recognize a lot of you here, and I'm really excited to see you. I see some new faces too, so excited to work with you. I work for VGS, where I do public policy development and public affairs work. And I come from a background in which I've worked on a lot of policy, both education policy, but also post-secondary education policy, and other things that I had the fun of working on in the General Assembly. Here at VGS, we are thinking about the climate workforce through the lens of a thermal energy provider in northwestern Vermont. But looking across the screen, there's a lot of folks here from different sectors who represent a lot of different interests. And I just want to echo something that Cara just said and thank Energy Action Network. We have been part as an organization of several of these working groups that Energy Action Network pulls together. And by pulling together a network team focused on issues, we've been able to be at the table with some folks who maybe we wouldn't be otherwise. And those conversations have led to the development of some very interesting policy, most recently, some of which you've probably heard about in the news through the Climate Action Plan that the Climate Council just released. And so that ability the Energy Action Network brings to pull together folks of different backgrounds is really exciting. And I'm just looking, I mean, we have people today representing industry, employees, state government, post-secondary education, career training, adult learning. I see some workforce development. I mean, we really have an interesting group here, renewable energy, and we really need your expertise and enthusiasm to meet the challenge before us. So I want to start when we talk about climate workforce by saying that today, we're going to start to get into the nitty-gritty of what we mean by thinking about not only a working definition of what that might be and using your expertise to understand it, but also by trying to identify some of the barriers that exist with workforce in Vermont. And we know that there are many. This is a conversation that is not new. We've heard a lot about the demographics of this state, about the workforce needs, and then the very unique workforce situation that we now have before us with the coronavirus pandemic. But at the same time, this conversation is really timely and urgent because we now have a new, very sweeping piece of public policy that's going to lead to a lot of change in Vermont, and that is the Global Warming Solutions Act. So as Cara indicated, we have people of different backgrounds, so I'm going to give you a quick overview of where things are. You might have heard of the Global Warming Solutions Act. This is the piece of public policy that actually set emissions reduction requirements in state law that the state must meet by changing policy with regards to both sector-specific emissions, so reducing emissions, but also at the same time, adaptation, resilience, and creating a blueprint forward for making some of these changes to do things like electrifying our vehicle fleet, doing fuel switching within homes. So we're moving toward increasingly renewable energy, and many forest and land management practices updates to ensure that we're meeting some of these climate goals of the state. And last week, the Climate Council, which was created by the Global Warming Solutions Act, they launched a report called the Climate Action Plan. This is the first in the state. And being responsive to the law, it introduced over 200, I think it's about 250 actions and strategies to actually make these changes in Vermont. Now, you might be wondering, what does this all mean? What it means is that that policy, that piece of public policy that's been brought forward will now go before the legislature during the legislature's 2022 legislative session. But additionally, over the course of the next year, it will go through a process of rulemaking through the State Agency of Natural Resources. All this is a way of saying that we now have a blueprint before us, and soon all the modeling and reports necessary to understand what kind of changes we're going to need to make, be it the installation of more than 100,000 heat pumps in Vermonters' homes, be it the electrification of our vehicle fleet with EVs and other things, and many, many other examples. I don't just want to dwell on those. But all this means that we're going to have to do some work to identify the people power necessary to make this happen. Because the other thing that happened in that Climate Council report is they made very clear none of it happens without people. And all of you in your corners of the world are probably very familiar with the challenges of workforce right now. And I'm just looking across the screen. We have representatives from the Agency of Education, from the Associated General Contractors, from Renewable Energy Vermont, from people who are doing workforce training. Each of you has seen through your lens the specific workforce needs of the state, and they're not specific to the climate workforce, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, what that might actually mean. You know, they are across sectors. If you need bus drivers right now and you're working at a school, you're probably struggling to find a bus driver. You know, if you need someone to operate a piece of heavy machinery, you're probably struggling to find one. At the same time, we now have this climate action plan, and we're beginning to understand the scope of change that's needed in the span of the next decade to meet our climate goals. And that's really the centering piece for this conversation and the backdrop that brings us here today. So I know that in the agenda, Cara had shared with you some information about the work, what we're hoping to do, and some of the draft thinking behind what we're viewing as our problem statement. And in simplest terms, we're activating this team of people from across sectors to try to develop a plan for how we will train, support, and retain the thousands of Vermont workers that we need with the skills to do these jobs. And we're going to talk about what those jobs are in a moment, but each of you is going to play a part. We really welcome your participation. We welcome your feedback. You know, I'm just one co-chair. Gabrielle Stebbins is also a co-chair with me. Cara from EAN is working in her capacity to lead this effort as well. We do not have all the answers. We have our own experiences, but we're going to rely heavily on the feedback we get. And as you look through things, if you have thoughts, feedback, we want to hear from you. We want to create a forum in which we can discuss at these monthly coalition meetings, methods and strategies that we can use to address climate workforce. And we want to hear if you think we're doing something a little off the mark so that we can pull it back on track. So that's what this group initiative's about. We're going to chat some more about next steps. But for now, I'd like to turn it over to Gabrielle Stebbins, if she is ready, to talk about how we're actually going to define climate workforce.
And I'm going to start off with asking everyone, and I'll start with me, assuming I can actually click enter. There we go. Your name and the entity that you're coming from. And I just want to reinforce, this is our first coalition meeting. And if we say anything that you're like, oh, I know all about that, or, you know, we've talked about that for decades. Please hear this meeting as an invitation to recognize that Dylan, myself, Cara, the folks on the steering committee really do recognize how many of us all have been working on this issue for a while. And so we're really open ears and wanting to hear from you. I just want to recognize on the steering committee, we have, besides myself as a state rep in the House Transportation Committee, we also have Representative Charlie Kimball joining us. He is on the Economic Development Committee. And then we also have Scott Campbell, who is on the Institutions Committee. And it's really great to have the legislative ears as part of this also. Not necessarily that anything that this group comes up with will turn into a bill. Perhaps it won't, perhaps it could. But just so that you know, we do have that type of representation. And Representative Kimball will be the first one to tell you, serving on his committee, that we have workforce challenges writ large in many different areas. And so no offense to anybody that we happen to be focusing in on climate workforce. Which brings me to the point that I get to discuss, which is how are we defining that at this point? And again, please recognize this is a draft. This is shared out via the email with the agenda information. And when we first started, we started with the understanding that there were efforts going on with weatherization. There were efforts going on with other types of contractor trainings. And the reason why we selected such a broad term as climate workforce, which if you work in the world of labor, really doesn't convey that much because it is not a tangible, discrete statement. We started with the term climate workforce because we're recognizing that there are many jobs across a variety of fields that will be needed to ensure we are able to actually meet our Global Warming Solutions Act requirements. So we have a broad definition of climate workforce. We're focusing on a subset that currently does not have enough people employed to reach the state's climate commitments. And the focus of this initiative is really to draw attention to and create excitement in the jobs and career pathways that can help mitigate climate change or improve community resilience. And specifically, the jobs that don't require four-year college or advanced degrees. Because if we're going to meet our Global Warming Solutions Act, and can we just call it GWSA for the rest of this meeting? If we're going to meet those targets, we can't be focusing our workforce discussion on degrees that might require 4 years of undergrad, then a master's, and then a PhD. So we're really focusing on the types of jobs that people may not know about when they're in middle school or high school, and they may not understand that while the job might appear to be just weatherizing a home, how that job can actually lead into a career pathway in an energy related field. And so we have a broad sort of overview. The job fields may include, may not be limited to, this is our first coalition meeting, and so we are really wanting to hear from you. Sustainable management of our forests, waterways, and working lands, technical vocational work that reduces greenhouse gas emissions in our buildings and transportation sectors, renewable energy generation, transmission, and storage improvements, as well as energy efficiency and demand management, and community adaptation and resilience projects. And so job titles, to get to the specifics, may be anything and everything related to electrician, plumber, solar installer, contractor with a Building Performance Institute certification, a forester, a logger, a farmer, maple sugar, and many others that moving forward, we will continue to identify and align according to the Department of Labor's occupational definitions. And in that definition of climate workforce one pager, we do have a link to that, so you can start to get a sense and a flavor of the types of definitions that are out there. Because as this group hones in on where to from here, really making sure that it's both concrete and yet broad, in terms of the job and the fields is going to be important to making sure that we're connecting the dots to be successful with this overall initiative. We also have a couple of additional resources in there. Some information from Vermont Clean Energy Industry Report, some recent white papers, etc. But I do want to note that we do have 30 minutes of breakout session to talk through all of this. So if you're like, wow, this is a lot, we're just giving the overview, and then we're going to go through breakout and discussion. So feel free to to put questions or comments in the chat, but we will definitely pick them up in the 30-minute discussion point. And then I will pass back to Dylan, who's going to talk a little bit about the barriers that through various discussions that several of us have had with several of the rest of you, we've initially drafted, understanding again that it's just a draft and just a start.
All right, bounce pass received here. So picking up the ball here, want to have this conversation quickly to tee up what we're going to have with a larger group discussion in small group format around barriers in particular, because part of what's really important at the outset here to understand is that we acknowledge that some of this work has been done, that a lot of people have thought of in this space about what's going on with our workforce needs, both by sector and by occupation, but additionally in broader terms about the needs of some of these occupations that might fall under this umbrella of climate workforce. And the barriers that we've heard and added into a document, if you click through the agenda, these are just some examples that we've heard, both from surveys that have been collected, where we've summarized some of the thinking here, but also from some of the course of discussions that we've had with our steering committee members and also with others who are in this field. And if you look at the document here, I see I've got a few random animals that Google has called out to show me that some of you are working in the document. I think that's me, the hippopotamus. I think that's what they're calling me, or maybe that's the badger. I don't know. But I'm linking you to the document here in the chat. You'll see that we've actually here attempted to categorize them a little bit by the barriers that might exist for different type of stakeholders or for different types of needs. For instance, the barriers for an individual might be a little different than the barriers for an employer, which might be different from the barriers that exist in terms of structure or policy. All of these could have overlap depending on the issue. For instance, like housing availability is an issue that employers are thinking about, that workers are thinking about, that there's probably a policy barrier or multiple policy barriers that others are thinking about. But the intention here was to begin to catalog some of these themes. Now, these are not going to rock your world, I don't think. You've probably heard a lot of these. But today we're going to have a discussion in a little bit to see if you have other barriers that you would want to add to these lists. So without going through all of them, I'll just point out that, you know, we sort of recognize that these are issues that touch on multiple industries, multiple parts of the state, that depending on the makeup of the state in terms of rural versus urban, Vermont urban, whatever you want to categorize it as, that there might be sort of different sets of these factors in play. But additionally, something that we often hear from employers is that, you know, they're competing with all these different factors and trying to find ways to attract workers. So certainly it's something that I'm sure many of you on the workforce side are thinking about, or on the employer side. And then for individuals as well, this is feedback that we hear every day. You know, it's reflected in news stories in terms of the barriers for housing, childcare, transportation. But then others that you hear about are things like just the practical barriers of, well, what if you don't have relevant work experience? What if there aren't earn and learn opportunities where you can do an apprenticeship or some sort of a skilled trade where you're skilling up through the process? So these should look familiar to you. As I said, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. In fact, there's a great report recently that a number of stakeholders, Efficiency Vermont, had worked on, where they actually began to look at the needs of workforce in some of these sectors. And so some of these ideas come from that. But others still you'll probably recognize, and I would expect that we will hear echoes of these themes today as we move through our conversations. I think that one of the pieces of feedback that we want to share at the outset before we turn this over to some small group discussion is that throughout all these barriers, there's sort of a sense that you know, a lot of you will probably nod your heads and say, yeah, we know about these barriers. They're out there. We've seen them. We've heard of them. And part of the opportunity here with this work group is not to create new work or extra work for work that's already been done, but to try to coordinate some of it and begin thinking about at a systems level, how we actually could think about what needs to happen at that individual employer or policy level to try to shake loose some of the pieces that are holding us back in these areas. So that's sort of a high level here. What we're going to do here shortly is have a discussion both about the barriers and about the definition. We're going to have members of our steering team and others lead some of those discussions. And before we get into that, we're going to have a presentation by Ellen Kayler from the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund. And I think Ellen has arrived. I don't know if she has her technology teed up and ready to go, but this is a really great presentation that Ellen brought to us. And we were so thrilled. She reached out when she heard that EAN was convening this initiative and said, hey, I'm actually doing some work in this area that might interest you. And as we began to think both at a systems level, but also at some of the information collecting level that we had started about how we frame all this for you, we thought that Ellen's presentation and the way that she was going about collecting information and sharing it was super helpful. So we want to give Ellen a chance to share some of that here with you today. And Ellen, if you're there and if you're ready, I will turn it over to you.
I am ready. Thanks, Dylan. Thanks so much for having me. I am the executive director of the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, but I also have been on the board of EAN since its inception. So I am right now, I guess I'm a lifer on the EAN board, so to speak. So know these work teams well in terms of their purpose and intent. So I'm happy to be here and offer whatever I can. I just want to also acknowledge that you guys have arranged for a fabulous conversation and have attracted a number of really excellent experts in the workforce space. And I just want to give a big shout out to Maureen Ebert from Vermont Technical College. And we've got Marianne Sheehan from the Vermont Talent Pipeline on board here. Sarah Buxton, who works at the Department of Labor, knows this stuff inside and out. Roxanne Vogt has been at VBSR, but she was doing an awful lot of workforce related stuff when she was at Advanced Vermont. So, and Jay Ramsey, of course, works with all the CTEs out of the Agency of Education. And there's probably others of you that I'm not as familiar with. John Young from the Vermont Training Program offers money for employers to train up and upskill workers, for instance. So just a phenomenal group of people here. And I just want to acknowledge that I am one mind in terms of what I can offer. And our hope here is that that you all are going to see things in it that make sense, and maybe some things that don't, and that we're going to co-create what this climate workforce is that we really need to create in the state. I also want to acknowledge before I share my screen that what I'm about to show you is very much a work in progress. So please do not get mentally hung up on anything in these diagrams, okay? Because we are in a different time and place than we were before COVID, and even I would say pre-2010 in terms of the workforce and the changing demographics. And so what I want to lay out here are some thought pieces for hopefully some sense making about what may be going on. It is not by any means the whole story. So as part of that co-creation generative process that is this work, generally, I want to just sort of really make that disclaimer because I'm hoping that these diagrams that I'm going to show you provide, again, some sense making and are helpful, but they are definitely evolving as we speak. And so much so that even Sarah Buxton and her primary role as a workforce development director for the state of Vermont Department of Labor has not seen some of these diagrams yet because they are still very much in development. So I just wanted to give that heads up. So without further ado, I'll launch in here. It's going to go fairly quickly, but I want to start with sort of a high level of, when you think about, can everybody see my screen okay? When you think about, put yourself in the seat of an employer. What is the type of labor market environment that you most like as an employer? You want high workforce participation, you want high unemployment, and you want a low number of jobs that are available listed, right? It's basically, you can cherry pick the best of the best. You have really stable workforce, and there's not a lot of jobs listed that you're having to do because you've got the workers you need. From an employee standpoint, it's just the opposite. If you're an employee, the best labor market for you is that there's a high number of jobs available and listed. There's a low workforce participation rate, and there's low unemployment, meaning you get to decide where you want to go. And you get to, and it is a time period where wages are increasing because there's not enough workers. Well, prior to COVID, and even before that, we were in a scenario here with the green boxes where employers were doing quite well in terms of being able to have the workers that they needed, and were able to find them no problem, and more or less able to have what they need. And now we're in this place. We're in a place where we have low workforce, we have increasing workforce participation. Maybe it's actually more of a medium workforce participation now that we're past the worst of COVID. But we have low unemployment, and we have a high number of jobs available, which means we have fewer workers than what is needed for the number of jobs and today, but also projected into the future. And this is a new state that we as employers, and I'm counting myself as an employer in this mix, need to really understand and grapple with. This is not going to change anytime soon in the foreseeable future. So I started having a conversation with Representative Tristan Tolino and with Adam Grinold, who runs the Brattleboro Development Credit Corp. Over the summer, we reached out and started having conversations with Tom Cheney at Advance Vermont, and with Marianne Sheehan at Vermont Talent Pipeline, and Carolyn Weir at the McClure Foundation, because we were just wanting to noodle on this. And we were thinking about, like, well, what does the actual workforce system look like today? If we had a system, whatever that system is, what is it today, and when was it designed, and what is it best suited for? And so we decided to take the conversation in a couple different places. And we first started with thinking about, well, from an employee perspective, if I'm looking for a job, what's the pathway that is available to me here in the state of Vermont? Hopefully you all can see this. The employee-centric pipeline is, there's lots of workplace training opportunities for apprenticeships. You can get badges. There's non-degree credentials that exist, like certifications and micro-credentials and licensure. Then there's the basic degree credentials. You can get your master's, you can get an associate's, you've got your high school diploma, whatever it is that you might want to do. These blue circles represent, that's a pathway for you to be able to get some kind of education to train you up for the workforce. And then what you have is, so this is something that the Department of Labor and the Agency of Education are doing a lot more on, is looking at this, what's called credentials of value, where there is some employer and Department of Labor agreed upon set of skills that if an employee takes some kind of a training, could be a certificate, could be any number of different types of trainings, that they could actually have that as almost like a passport, like I can do this, and then employers would recognize that. And there is a process for validating what those credentials are about. And that's very much still in development. And then you have a whole bunch of entities that exist in Vermont that provide various education and training. You've got CCV and Vermont Tech's continuing education department. You've got Vermont Works for Women and Resource. I see Tom Longstreth is here. You have adult CTEs, adult basic learning. There's all sorts of organizations that can help would-be workers to train up, to improve their skill sets and be able to get out into the workforce. That's what exists, more or less, our sense of the universe from an employee-centric perspective. Then if you take a look at it from an employer perspective, well, how do employers train up and get the kind of workers that they need? What's available to them? Well, you have things like you can offer paid internships. There's on-the-job training. There's apprenticeships that you can offer, especially if you're a union. And Vermont Department of Labor has a whole way of approving and having registered apprenticeships. You can do workplace transformation projects where, for instance, you reduce some of the jobs that are hardest to fill through automation, for instance, or changing of culture so that you can attract workers. You can outsource your employment pipeline needs to others. You can, for instance, you can use the Vermont Training Program as a way of training or upskilling workers. You can work with the Center for Continuing Education and Workforce Development, Vermont Tech, to train up folks of jobs that you need filled, for instance. You can contract out with private sector trainers. And then there's also capacity building organizations that can help you through learning best practices that improve your workplace culture. Or for instance, Vermont Manufacturing Extension Center, VMAC, they can do like lean office or lean manufacturing and actually improve your competitiveness and your productivity rates, for instance. And then there's a whole universe of other organizations that are support organizations that can often help employers. For instance, a regional development corporation, you might have some business that goes out of business and they lay off 200 workers, and those workers need new homes, need to go someplace. Well, a regional development corporation could work with other employers in their region who need workers to actually do skill matching up and helping those employers, for instance, find new workers. There's various statewide organizations and such, all of which can help employers to strengthen their pipeline. And one of the things that we identified has been really missing in all of this is more organizations that are system connectors. There are some organizations that play that role now. Vermont Talent Pipeline Management, for instance, Marion Sheehan Shop, the McClure Foundation with their Promising Pathways work. There are some sector-specific entities, like I would put EAN's workforce work team as part of this. They're all part of this system of helping to think about those critical functions in our various economic sectors of what's needed. And then you also have the whole socioeconomic support system that helps folks to actually stay in the workforce, whether that's childcare or reach up, workforce housing, for instance. Working Fields helps to work with potential employees that maybe have a record for incarceration or addiction issues to actually get into the workforce and be supported in that. So there's a whole support system in that. And then, as I mentioned, I've been feeling like there's been a real lack of emphasis on the use of what's now being termed navigators, employer-employee connectors. There are some capacity at the Agency of Human Services through their Workforce Solutions team that can work with folks that maybe have more difficulties entering the workforce to find valid employment. But there's guidance counselors, and there's Advanced Vermont and college career counselors and such. But there still does seem to be a lack of having sufficient navigators. VDOL has its one-stop and their Vermont Job League program. There's career fairs that happen. So these are all the different ways, the things that exist, right, that are out there. And seems like there's a stranded circle out here that's supposed to be over here. So I'm gonna move it back because I was wondering, where did my center circle here go? One of the amazing things of Mural is you can move things around. So these are employer-led recruitment and training initiatives. Sorry about that. So the point is here that there is this universe of a system that exists. And as I mentioned when we first started, that system was built over time and made sense, and it was built up at a time when this was our labor scenario, where there were plenty of workers, and there were, and we could easily, employers could easily find people getting graduated either from high school or associate's degree or college who could fill those jobs, and we were just fine. But now with our demographics, now with changes going on generally in the workforce, we do not have enough workers. And so our thinking about this is that we need to think about, well, how do we, what is the current market like? And the way that I would offer to think about this is that is actually more like 3-dimension. Unfortunately, I only can give it to you in 2-dimension, but the 3-dimension of this is where are we at with high or low labor force participation? Where are we at, high or low, with the unemployment rate? And where are we at with high or low related to job openings? And so for right now, today, where we are at, our estimation is we have low to moderate workforce participation, we have a high number of job openings, and we have a low unemployment rate. So given that, then what would be the leverage points that we would want, and policy strategies that might support moving things back into balance, where we have a good amount of labor force participation, a good amount of job openings, and a good and a relatively low unemployment rate, which means we have sort of a balance where employers and employees are finding each other. It's supporting the growth of the industry, of any given industry. We have enough workers, and we can move from there. So to just offer up sort of another thing that's very much in development then is we're starting to think about and put some meat on the bones of that diagram to get at, well, what are the strategies for leverage points and strategies when you have let's just say a low workforce participation rate? What are the things that would, in essence, help people to get back to actually enter the workforce who may be sitting on the sidelines, for instance? Well, one of the leverage points might be certain kind of financial incentives or changing the working age population size. And then what would be some of the policies that would then flow from those leverage points? You could promote recruitment of recently retired workers. You could promote more retention strategies, invest in childcare to make it easier for people to be in the workforce, invest in public transit, encourage wage growth to get, again, people that are on the sidelines into working again. And so one of the things you can see down here, state programs aligned with these strategies. We're still very much in development, and I'm hoping Sarah's going to help us. Sarah Buxton's going to help us with this. Is, what are those strategies and that are in the state's plans already that really align with these types of strategies? Conversely, I'll just do one more, but so we can then jump into our breakout sessions. So right now we have a high number of job openings. So what are the leverage points? Well, we need to do a better job of pipeline development, meaning how do we help people to see that there's job opportunities and then figure out a more clear pathway to actually being able to attain those jobs. Again, working age population size, financial incentives, thinking about what would be the barriers to getting more people into those positions, and then access to upskilling. Again, this is not exhaustive. That's part of the reason why we want to have these breakout conversations, is to think about, for the climate workforce development, we know we're going to be having a high number and growing number of jobs that are needed, thus job openings. What are those leverage points that would help develop a pipeline of workers in Vermont who are interested in being part of the climate workforce? What are some of those strategies that might be able to be helpful? Now, some of these strategies might feel like they're not really connected to the climate workforce, meaning like reducing barriers to childcare subsidies or having an FMLA policy in the state, for instance, but others might feel more like doing more to support people with formerly incarcerated or addiction challenges, or expanding CTEs, career technical education centers, and finally fixing the funding formula that has prevented a lot of more young people from taking advantage of CTEs, for instance. So these are the kinds of things that I think that Kara and Gabrielle and Dylan are really wanting all of you to be thinking about, is what might be those leverage points, what might be those policy strategies, and to think about it in terms of this framework, if it's helpful to you all, of where we are in this space and time, and being able to consider what are those potential strategies that are going to make the most sense, given that we have this a shortage of labor at this point in our trajectory. And that, I want to just be really clear, that is not to say that anything that has come before is wrong or bad, because that is not the case, right? It made sense for that time. and for that kind of a labor market and that kind of a labor force participation rate. And so, but we're in a different time, and our notion is that thus our leverage points and our strategies may need to shift so that we can take advantage of this new time and really help employers to get the kind of employees that they really need at this point. So I'll stop there, and hopefully I didn't go too over Dylan and Gabrielle and Kara. I was trying to go really fast.
Ellen, you went really fast. That was really fabulous. I know that we could spend the next half hour talking about that and asking you, doing a Q&A, but we're not going to. There's one question that was in the chat that I'd like to bring forward, Ellen, which is people are interested in seeing this and be able to play with it. And my understanding is that's not ready for that yet, but are there other ways that people will be able to engage with this? Would you like to just quickly let us know?
Honest answer, I don't know yet. I mean, what we could do is easily provide you with this, and then you could use it and change it around and add to it. I will say that one of the things that we did recently with the forest product sector, I'll show you that we were talking about possibly doing at your next meeting, was to think about, well, what are those, this is for all these green dots are for the forest product sector. So what are the types of employee pathways, and what are the types of connectors? Just look at the dark green here. Don't try to read anything. Just look, just get a sense of oh, these dark green make sense to the forest products industry leaders, for instance. So it might be that a next step could be coming from a climate workforce lens. What's on this sort of the universe of what's out there now relates to the climate workforce, and then that might help you to think about where there's gaps, where there's needs for additional focus, that kind of a thing. So let me work, Kara, with you in thinking about how best to make this available. But yes.
Terrific. Thank you, Ellen. Okay, so I have a plea to you right now not to leave, because what we're going to do next is we're going to go into breakout groups. And I know that when that happens, sometimes we lose some folks, but we brought you all together here specifically because we also want to hear from you. So I'm going to quickly share my screen to show you the document that I've put together, and maybe Dylan or Gabrielle can put a link to it in the chat so that people can go to it. Right now I have, I think it is 6 breakout groups of 7 people each that have been set up. Each of those breakout groups has at least one person from the steering committee that's been in this conversation so far. So when I open those breakout groups, you will go there and you will have a facilitator who's one of the people who's been on the steering committee. If for any reason you don't have someone, just choose someone to be your facilitator. And we'll need a note taker so that we can capture your conversation so that it can go forward in the work that we're doing. So when you get in this document, you'll see that there are different breakout groups listed. We don't need all of these, but that's okay. You'll just click on whichever your Zoom group is. So if you're invited to Zoom group 1, you'll go to breakout group 1. Oh, the heading's not existing. I'll fix that, but you can scroll down. All of these note-taking areas have the exact same questions, and it's just to guide you through the conversation. Please introduce yourselves. Take a few minutes to talk about that draft climate workforce and barriers that were shared. Take a few moments to talk about that wonderful presentation by Ellen. And then if you have some time at the end, it'd be great to hear from you what's missing and who is missing from this conversation as we're just getting started. And so that conversation can go until 1:10. So there's 25 minutes for that conversation. And then when we get back, we will ask our steering committee members to do a really brief recap of the conversation you just had. Okay? Any questions on what we're doing? Great. I'm going to open those breakout groups and look forward to the conversations. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I am sorry to pull you out of those conversations. I'm sure that the one I was in was very interesting. I'm sure they all were. We managed to keep most of our participants through that whole process, which is fabulous. I'd like to give a moment for a report out from each of the groups. So I'm just going to do a roll call here and start with Representative Kimball. Would you be willing to do a report out from your group?
Sure. Thanks, Kara. We had a good discussion. First, Ellen Kayler was part of our group, so she had some immediate feedback on what her presentation was. And most felt it was an accurate presentation. We had a great couple of suggestions. One is to make sure that we engage young persons who are already committed to climate change, and somehow engage them and find a way that that they can be made aware of opportunities for them. And the concept of a civilian climate corps, and that came from Andrew in our group, which is a great idea as to bring that about. And also recognizing there's still a stigma attached to some career and technical education programs. If you have to leave your school and go to a CTE to pursue something, there's a stigma still attached to it. And that it's a dynamic environment. That was one thing about Ellen's system that she set up, is really looking at the dynamic relationship between jobs and workers. When we were talking about the barriers for individuals or building the climate workforce, one was scalability in terms of a business trying to provide their training programs and training those individuals. It's hard to scale up in order to meet your total need based on how much time you have to take to train those people. A second is making sure that the apprenticeship programs are aligning with some of the industry needs more specifically. So that handles some of that. And the other one is, we've heard it before, is creating a central database that has all the different programs, and I'm sure Advanced Vermont can talk about it, but creating that central database that has all the different programs that exist, and so employers and potential employees could get there. And only one more thing, and I'm trying to find a piece of paper, the definition of climate workforce. It was great that the emphasis wasn't on people needing to achieve a 4-year degree. So I thought that emphasis was right. The second is really not to be sure not to include someone in their job, but also with a particular job, but also not to be so broad as to not be effective in any one area. So there's that delicate balance to achieve there. So that was our group.
Thank you so much. Dylan Giambattista.
All right. So we had a great group with several folks spanning different areas. And the conversation, one of the key takeaways was the importance of fostering and sparking passion. So drawing attention to these occupations and what they mean, and really tapping into excitement, particularly from a younger generation of workers around climate jobs. Really interesting conversation about sharing information about what these jobs actually entail, and a discussion about the fact that some of these occupations are dirty jobs. They might suffer from sort of fears of occupational hazards or just workplace conditions that people aren't necessarily comfortable with. So making sure that they understand what these jobs entail, and then also what the career pathways might be should they wish to expand their skill set and apply in another area that would be applicable to a climate occupation. We had some feedback that the government silos, sometimes it's hard to know how to connect the initiatives, that there's all these multiple organizations in Vermont. So having everyone at the table, knowing who's doing what, is important, so that doesn't become a barrier. And then finally, in the barriers and definitions piece, we had talked about the compensation challenge in Vermont, that there's a bit of a Vermont premium that workers are assessing when they scale up jobs in this state versus maybe other regional players or other parts of the country. And just making sure that folks understand how their skill set that they're developing can lead to compensation and what those opportunities are. In terms of the presentation that we had from Ellen, we discussed a bit about how do you really understand the compensation and employment opportunities for non-college bound Vermonters, and help those Vermonters understand what is out there and what is possible for jobs. Career pathways was a frequent theme that we talked about. Really interesting, this thought that we need to develop materials about the opportunities in the trades, and bring those to kids in Vermont classrooms so that they understand what's out there, because there was a discussion about needing to scale these jobs, not just over the next 10 years, but this is really, you need to have a multiplier effect where they're scaling over time to meet all of the needs and the occupations that are out there. We were fortunate to have Amanda from Advanced Vermont in our group. So she discussed some of the career exploration tools that are available, such as myfuturevt.org, and whether or not there was an opportunity to bring into the categorization green jobs, which is an interesting discussion. there was also just some talk about the need to fund a targeted outreach campaign around these occupations to change some of the perception or to seed it in people's minds, what's out there. For the final piece, in terms of who or what is missing, we had a discussion about working to ensure that the participants in this group and other meetings represent our diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. And then there was a discussion as well about bringing in the tech centers to make sure that we're reaching students at tech centers. So that was a brief summary.
Thank you so much, Dylan. Representative Stebbins.
Thanks, Cara. We had some weatherization experts, architects, representative from education and representative from economic development. So a really great cross sector. Our conversation was, I guess I get the not great award for not keeping my folks answering the question specifically. We had more of a discursive feedback about what folks heard overall. From the educational perspective, Jay was really hearing and thinking about the totality of the education system, and that yes, it's important to prepare kids to understand climate change and climate related jobs, but what this also means in terms of training our teachers, and then even thinking about our school facilities and the maintenance people who work there, as well as the career guidance counselors, and how do you really tie into the opportunities that are out there into a student's personal drive to solve big problems like this. We had some feedback from our architects in terms of how it's great to have a lot of goals, such as code enforcement, code upgrades, that we're seeing some exhaustion from the architecture community and others with policies that are unfunded mandates that are not enforced, where there's code confusion and there may be building permit issues, and then it just becomes this bit of a black hole. And how do we start to connect older professionals, sort of the custodians of the job, to younger professionals who are coming in? We also had some good statistics, because there was a question about why is the participation rate so low? How do we get more weatherization workers into the field here in Vermont? So we had a great statistic that in 2009, when we had a major recession, the stock market, plummeted. There was an assessment that there would be 20,000 shy moving forward in our workforce, and we're now more than that. A follow-up statistic from that is that we only have about 64% of our population that is working. So that we're at a really interesting point where if we could use some sort of driver to promote Vermont to come here, to promote people from outside of Vermont to come here, or to promote people who are sitting on the sidelines for whatever reason to get back engaged in the workplace, that would be really helpful. And this person said, I come from all sectors, so it's great if we're working on climate workforce. And I thought this was a great quote. But if we don't have enough nurses to care for someone who's injured on a work site, that doesn't work either. So, is there something that the legislature can do, a statewide FMLA or other carrots that really help draw people to the state? From the weatherization perspective, great, we can train people. It needs to be done right. If we do it poorly, if we do it wrong, that's no good. And also just recognizing that people are recognizing that a 4-year degree isn't necessary for everything, but that some amount of post-secondary training is needed for about 70% of the jobs. So what are those credentials? What are those certificates? And making sure that we have the right training opportunities to ensure that people can demonstrate that they have the skills that are needed. And lastly, some question about how can we get, why are we not getting some excitement about a climate conservation corps at the federal level? And I mentioned, Vermont is kind of the outlier of, federal viewpoints compared to other states. But the real question here was, how do we draw across the aisle? And say, hey, folks, actually, weatherization jobs, these jobs that save people money, improve their buildings, address mold and mildew, save them money. These are win-win-wins, no matter how you vote. And I'll pass it back to you, Carl.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to Representative Campbell.
Hi there. Geez, everybody's made all these points that I don't want to repeat. We talked in our group a little bit more about the front end, about students in high school and in middle school. How do we get them? We talked about the stigma around trades, and how do we get them to see working in a trade as a stepping stone to a career, as part of a career. That might be more interesting in there are dirty jobs in the beginning, but it might be more interesting work in the end. So we talked also about job counseling, and one of the questions that I have is whether there is some sort of online job counselor where kids can go, students can go to in effect get an analysis of their personality and their predilections and see what kinds of jobs, kinds of careers would match their preferences. Let's see what some other people put some notes in here. One important addition to the things that people have already said is many employers aren't aware of the kinds of training opportunities or training programs that we have now, VTech being a prime example. All of the students who come out of VTech are very well prepared for jobs in their fields, and they all get jobs in their fields. But a lot of employers just aren't aware of VTech and other programs that we have already existing. So I think I'll leave it at that, because everyone has already talked about the other things. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for editing it down to the new ideas. That's really helpful. Our next group, I think it's Kelly Lucci who's reporting out. I know Sarah Buxton was also in that group. Great.
Yep, I'm going to report out. I invited folks to jump in if I mischaracterize anything. So I don't want to belabor points that have already been made. We had kind of a broader discussion than the questions. Just I'll own that as a facilitator. It just got too interesting for me to make people answer the questions that you called out. But thank you, Cara. So a couple points that were made. Just thinking about the broader. It's a complex system. So there were a few points made around just the context that we're operating in that I feel like are important to call out. So firstly, we're having an acute issue right now. We may need to rely on out-of-state employers and workers to meet that need. However, defining the specific projects and occupations that are needed will enable much more focused engagement with employers, and for us to be able to generate and implement solutions. So that need for a real focus was called out, and we felt like that was very important context to emphasize. Additionally, there's burnout and mental health challenges that folks are facing right now that are real, and we wanted to make sure we named that and called out that there may be people who are in the job market right now who actually aren't really ready or able to work, and that's a piece of context we can't forget. Finally, we have to be realistic when we set priorities. We're not going to get 10,000 workers right now. Sarah provided some great context on 1,500 folks right now who got unemployment checks last week. So at most, we're talking about a couple hundred workers that we can access. We can't say we need 10,000 people. So that was a context. Second area and kind of bucket I wanted to call out is, all right, so if we need to be focused, what are some of the areas we think we really need to focus on? And so some of the occupations we named out, construction professionals for something like weatherization, electricians, plumbers, and HVAC contractors as sort of being the keystone roles. However, really important context that Melanie provided, which is, she's engaging right now with employers who are actually laying folks off because the supply chain for materials is so messed up right now as it relates to weatherization. And that is obviously the exact opposite of the situation we want to be seeing right now. And as we dug in a little bit talking about that additional challenge layered on all the others we're discussing, Sarah made a great point that if we're talking about transportation, distribution, sales and service, those are constraints, worker constraints that cut across a whole range of workforce related conversations that are taking place right now. So important for us, we're coming at this from a perspective of climate, but let's not forget the areas of overlap with the other dialogues that's underway, because if we don't have materials to weatherize homes, it doesn't matter how many workers we get trained and deployed in the field. Employers still won't be able to put those folks to work doing the work that we want to see. So really important to think about that broader system. And I'll invite anybody else to jump in if I missed anything.
I'm going to go ahead and transition us to Tom. So I have 1 minute left at the end to close things up.
Okay, I'll try to hit the highlights. In terms of the definition, there was one criticism. The only criticism was that there was a heavy focus on energy, and there might usefully be a bit more focus on some of the other pollutants that are part of the climate problem. In terms of barriers, there was a comment that it might be useful to have some prioritization and reorganization so that we more adequately understand the negative synergy that can create a snowball effect, sort of layering of problems. And then that the complex problems related to these barriers require that we bring a diverse group together, that good solutions are going to need a spirit of cooperation and coordination. In terms of other comments was that the best training is going to, there's in relation to Ellen's report that Ellen's sort of visuals showed vocational training, social supports, and matchmaking between workers and employers. And I think some of the best programs will combine all of those elements into a single program. And then the other comment was, how do we recognize the skills of foreign educated workers whose credentials are not recognized or valued here? And that was also another barrier, is the challenge of non-native English speakers. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Wow, thanks all of you. I'm hoping that you will all stay in this conversation. I'm posting right now in the chat what the schedule is for monthly meetings going forward. We'll start January 10th and have these meetings the second Monday of each month. I will also, as we close up this meeting, I will send out a link to the video of the meeting. It won't have the breakout groups, but it will have the rest of the conversation that we had. And I'll also send out a survey that invites you to add any thoughts you've had since then about the questions that we've posed. So I'll send that out later today or early tomorrow to see if there's any other feedback that you can give us, because we really do need all of your thoughts as we get this, this project moving forward. Let's see, Sarah is asking us to share the climate action plan. We can do that as well in that email as well. So thank you all so much for joining us. I'm sorry we don't have any more time for questions or Q&A, but this has been a really helpful conversation and we look forward to continuing it with all of you. Gabrielle and Dylan, do you want to say any other closing remarks?
No,
Thanks very much, and please keep with us.
Thank you. And we will end all of our meetings on time. So this is setting a good precedent for all of us, but really appreciate you coming. And Cara, thank you for setting this up and facilitating. You did very well.
Thanks.
Thank you,
all right,
everybody.
we'll see you all in January. Bye.
All right, thanks.